Hey, hello everybody. We are finally coming in here for a video in April, which I realize it's been a month, but so be it. So we're finally coming in for a video for this month of April, and as I mentioned in our last video a month ago, it's going to be one of our next topics. So today, what we're going to cover, given that I realize that this year is a certain historical anniversary, it marks 500 years since 1521, which was the year that the Aztec Empire was officially conquered by the Spanish. We are going to go ahead today and cover the fall of the Aztec Empire. Also, otherwise, you could also call it particularly, we could refer to it as the fall of Tenochtitlan, which was the Aztec capital. When the Aztec capital fell, it basically marked the end of the Aztec Empire. The Aztecs were thrown into disarray, never really mounted a major threat to Spanish colonial rule again in the New World. So as always, let's go ahead here, and we're going to start with a little bit of background into the subject. Mostly, we're going to be looking at who exactly the Aztec are. We're not so much the colonization of the Spanish. I mean, we'll touch up on that briefly because most of us probably remember it, at least that Christopher Columbus came over here in 1492. We probably remember that, but there might be a few details that we review. But mostly, we're looking at who are the Aztec. Now, the Aztec are a Native American people that were native here to North America, and they were originally known as the Mexica, which is where the name Mexico comes from, because they lived in what is now Mexico. Mexico's name comes from the Mexica people, the Aztecs. And they were originally a hunter-gatherer kind of people. They were originally nomads. They wandered from place to place, chasing their food. They were not settled down agricultural people. They were nomads. And they would move around and migrate into Mesoamerica, which is basically Mesoamerica is Central America, basically Mexico down to Panama. But in this case, we're calling Mesoamerica mostly just the area around the countries of Mexico, Guatemala, and Belize, and maybe even El Salvador if we want to go there. But the Mexica people migrated into Mesoamerica in the early 13th century. So this is about the 1200s. This is about 200 years before the Europeans really set foot over in the New World. Now, the Aztecs, as they eventually came to be known, had their own unique language. Their language was known as Nahuatl. Now, although the Aztec people themselves are gone today, their language has still managed to survive, as there were other Native American peoples that did speak that language. However, the Nahuatl language is very much odd. It's not really spoken. There's not really a whole lot of spoken dialogue in the language. It is more pictures. It is more graphics than it is spoke. It's not as verbal. It's not a really verbal language. And thus, that presented a problem for European colonists that came over here and were trying to translate the native language of Nahuatl into English or Spanish or whatever European language it was, because it was sometimes very hard to translate things from that language due to the fact that they weren't really a verbal language at all, and you're trying to translate something that's not been spoken. So you're trying to translate a verbal word when there is no verbal word. So it was not exactly the easiest language, and it's still not. It's actually one of the hardest languages to learn in the modern day world. But if you ever want to go up on it, by all means, try to study Nahuatl. There are very few speakers, I think, left in the world, so if you are learning how to speak that, it's actually benefiting world cultural history, because it's keeping that language alive. But anyway, the Aztecs had their own language, Nahuatl, and they called themselves Aztec eventually because they claimed to have come from the land of Aztlan. Now, where Aztlan was, we have no idea, but most scholars kind of predict that the land may have been on the Pacific coast of Mexico, maybe even the northwest coast near the Baja California area, just south of the border with California. But we're not absolutely certain where this land was. But this is where the Aztec claim that they came from, and thus they derived their name from that land, the Aztec. Now, the Aztecs moved as they came into Mesoamerica in the 1200s, they eventually moved further into it, and they settled in the Valley of Mexico, which was becoming of the climate of the time. The Valley of Mexico is where Mexico City is today. And at the time, it was very much a lush paradise almost. It wasn't desert. It was populated with plants. It was plenty of water. There was a big, massive lake right in the middle of the valley, Lake Texcoco. And this lake provided enough water for a kind of an oasis of sorts in the Mexican wilderness. It was a lush valley, ripe for settlement. And there were already other native people there. Well, the Aztec come in, they say, we're going to live here too. Once they move into the valley, Aztec society changes immensely. They go from being these nomads to they like this land so much that they found that they now actually settle down for the first time in their history and become agricultural based. They still hunt, but they are now actually farming. They're farming crops such as tomatoes, potatoes, avocados, maize, which is corn, beans, squash. These were the crops that they were growing at that time period. Keep in mind that these are American crops, as this was before the Europeans came over here, and thus they didn't have all the crops that we would know of today. There was no wheat, there was no barley, there was no citrus fruits, there was no apples, there was none of that. That was not over here before the Europeans came over here. But anyway, they become farmers in the valley, but they also continue to hunt, and they hunt animals such as coyotes, snakes, armadillos, turkeys, and rabbits. These are the basic food sources for the Aztec. Now, the Aztec eventually developed a unique and sophisticated land cultivation and irrigation method, and it was through this that they were able to really flourish in the Valley of Mexico. They developed some very complex irrigation systems and even canalways in order to water their crops. And in fact, in their major capital city of Tenochtitlan, which we will get to here in a second, the whole city was basically a network of canals to get from one section of the city to another. They were really marvelous in their engineering skills, far more sophisticated at irrigation and canal building than the Europeans were halfway across the world. Now, the Aztecs also built a very powerful army at this time of native people, and this was done through military traditions. It was very common that Aztec men were mandated that they had to serve in the Aztec army for a certain period in their lives. And for a little bit further into Aztec culture, how it's also influenced in Spanish and English. As we mentioned, the Nahuatl language, I found some words here that we commonly use in English today and Spanish into a way, but these are the English forms of the words. But these are words in English, at least, that we have actually derived from the Aztec. Originally, these words came from the Aztec. They were not English, they were not Spanish, and they were not French words. They were originally derived from the Aztec, and they were some of the few that managed to be translated from Nahuatl. The words like chocolate is originally an Aztec word. Chile, or Chile, or Chile, or however you want to say it, that was an Aztec word. Coyote, ocelot, avocado, guacamole. These were all Aztec Nahuatl words that got translated into Spanish and English. They were not originally European words. Now, the Aztecs, as we mentioned, they've settled in the Valley of Mexico. And they're becoming an agricultural society, but they've not really become very, very strong in the valley, I should say. They've established a foothold, but not a permanent base of power. And this comes when the Aztec go further into the Valley of Mexico, and as they head further into it, they come upon Lake Texcoco, which we have discussed here briefly. The big lake in the middle of the valley. It's a massive lake. And they come into this lake, and they see, there was an old Aztec legend that they would build a city, supposedly, whenever they saw an eagle eating a snake while it was standing on a cactus in the middle of a lake. Well, the Aztec come here, and lo and behold, the legend is that the Aztec found just such a sight. They saw a rock out in the middle of the lake, an outcrop of rock. There was a cactus growing on it, and there was literally an eagle on top, perched on the cactus while it was eating a snake. And supposedly, this led to their founding. How truthful that is, I don't know. But if you ever actually look at the Mexican flag, they have that depicted on the white vertical bar of the Mexican tricolor flag. That is where that eagle and snake and on the cactus and everything comes from. It's from that old Aztec legend. Now, the Aztec supposedly saw this at Lake Texcoco, and they decided that this was where they were intended to have to build their new capital city, which they named Tenochtitlan. And they built that there in about 1325. So the Aztecs now have a major power base in the Valley of Mexico, but it's not really until a century later that they really actually start to establish an empire of sorts. And in 1428, this is when this begins, the Aztecs, under their emperor Itzcoatl, formed a triple alliance with surrounding tribes in the Valley of Mexico in order to conquer the valley. They were not allied with every tribe, but they more allied with the most powerful tribes that could be the most beneficial in a fight to conquer the valley. Now, Itzcoatl's successor, Moctezuma I, was the great warrior ruler who actually accomplished the conquering of the Valley of Mexico. Itzcoatl started it by forming this triple alliance, which would continue until the fall of the Aztec Empire due to the Spanish. But it was his successor, Moctezuma I, who was actually the one responsible for conquering the entire valley and getting it under Aztec rule, and thus he created the Aztec Empire after he came to power in 1440. At its height, the Aztec Empire eventually ruled over about, let me see how I got it written down, over about 500 states and about 5 to 6 million people. It was actually one of the largest percentage kingdoms or empires, whatever you want to call it, in the world at the time. And of course, the Europeans had no idea about it. This was on the other side of the world. Tenochtitlan alone had a population larger than most European cities. Its population at its height was 140,000 people. This is massive for a Native American city, because we commonly don't think that they were all that sophisticated as a European society. We thought they were more simpler. No, the Aztec in particular were becoming very sophisticated, and it's sometimes at par, if not greater than, the European standards of living in Europe. Now, the Aztec, discussing here, we all know that the Aztec were like a warlike people. This was mostly influenced partly by their religion. They had a belief in a polytheistic religion. They had many, many different gods. But I think, if I remember right, two of the most powerful was the god of the rain and the god of the lightning, thunder, whatever you want to call it. Basically, the sky. We'll say the sky gods. The sky gods were supposedly the most important and powerful, and these were the ones the Aztecs feared and revered the most. Now, this also influenced their warfare. Firstly, we're going to discuss this. The Aztec did not kill during warfare. Most armies, if you go into warfare today, your main objective is to kill the enemy. The Aztec were told not to kill the enemy. Your main goal is not to kill them, but to capture them. We want them as prisoners. And the Aztec wanted them as prisoners because they needed human sacrifices. The Aztecs, as we all know, practiced human sacrifice to their gods, as we probably all heard about the tearing out the heart and everything else. That is very much true. They would literally cut the heart out as this victim was still alive and present it on the top of the temple. And sometimes it wasn't just one. They would sometimes massacre or sacrifice up to 100 or more men a day, just in a row. Just, okay, bring the next one, and next one, next one. But the Aztec did not commonly sacrifice their own people. That is not what they aimed to do. This was why they went to war. The Aztec went to war all the time because they saw these prisoners of war that were not Aztec in origin. These were perfect sacrifices. That way they didn't have to sacrifice their own people, but they could still appease their gods. So the purpose of Aztec warfare was to gain human sacrifices. Thus, they didn't like to kill people in warfare. They would prefer to capture you if they could. Which, honestly, if you're faced with an Aztec warrior and you got the prospect of either being captured by him or killing yourself, I recommend you kill yourself, because I don't think you want to go to the Aztec temple and have your heart ripped out. Keep in mind, you're still alive when they start cutting open. I think I would rather commit suicide than become a prisoner of the Aztec. Now, the empire, well, another big difference here was the empire was also not like a traditional European-style empire. This is not, the Aztec Empire was we call it an empire, but it wasn't the standard empire that we commonly think of, such as that of Rome, or the Ottoman Empire, or the British Empire, the Spanish Empire. This was not a European-style empire. This wasn't even like the Asian ones, like in China or Japan, or the Mogul. the Aztec Empire was not ruled directly. They were not like provinces and governors over certain regions. No, they were not ruled directly. The Aztec Empire was more ruled through fear, and it was a tribute system, actually. The Aztec did not impose direct rule over their subjects, but instead they ruled through the tribute and fear of attack. They basically had their subject peoples and states pay them money as tribute and threatened that if you don't pay us money or tribute in either money or precious metal or sacrifices, human sacrifices, sometimes they would ask for that, but if you don't give us that, we will attack you and kill you all. It was basically an empire made of fear and coercion. And there was also a caste system in the Aztec Empire. And of course, the Aztec people themselves were sitting at the very top of that caste system. Anyone that was a Native American that was not of Aztec origin, of course, you're a lower class. But it's important to note the Aztec Empire, we called it an empire, but it's not our standard empire. It's very loosely organized. It's very loosely maintained. It's not maintained directly through taxation. It's not maintained directly through direct rule. It's more fear and intimidation, keeping the neighboring surrounding states in line to the Aztec. So here we have a couple photos that will go on here before we continue. That are probably worth showing. But here we have just kind of a map of the Aztec Empire in about 1519 at its height when the Spanish first came into contact with it. This is, of course, all this white stuff is Mexico. Then you have the Gulf of Mexico here, and the Pacific Ocean over here. Right here was Tenochtitlan, but for some reason they spelled it a little odd here. But this was the heart of the Aztec Empire. This little very dark area right here. And then you also had this. Actually, I'm wrong. Tenochtitlan is up there. My bad. Right here's the heart of the Aztec Empire. That's their capital. You have another major allied state here, which is one of those tribes. And then you have all this, and then the tributary states that were paying tribute in order to avoid being attacked. They weren't officially part of the Aztec, but they were being forced into being part of the Aztec Empire. And then this is what the Aztec Empire controlled. And here, I told you that Tenochtitlan was really a magnificent marvel of engineering. When the Europeans actually came over here and found the city in 1519, they were stunned at how marvelous the construction of this city had been, where the canals laced every part of it. It was literally it was a city in the middle of a lake. The Aztec built their capital right in the middle of the lake Texcoco, with roads leading to the shore. And if just to give you an idea of what this would have looked like, this is like a artist rendering, but this is basically what you're looking at. You have the massive lake here, massive lake Texcoco. Then you have these little routes that go up to the shore. They go to the shore. But right here sitting in the middle is this big old city. This is the Aztec city. And then if you really look closely, you can see there's canals that come in and they just go inward to the city. The whole city is basically divided up into sections by the canals. Those were the main roads in Tenochtitlan. It wasn't paved roads, it was canals, canalways, and little waterways inside. This was the magnificent wonder that stunned Europeans, because before that they had not encountered a native people that had so sophisticated in architecture, so sophisticated of a engineering building ability as they saw here at the Aztec capital. This was something that they had not expected to find in the New World. Here we have artist rendering of the main temple at the very center of Tenochtitlan. This was the main Aztec temple, the Templo Mayor, which was also the place where, unfortunately, they committed the human sacrifices on top of this big one. If you go to Mexico City today, which we'll discuss that later, Mexico City actually sits on top of the old Aztec capital, and we'll get to that why. But if you go to Mexico City, they have actually begun to excavate the base foundations of this massive temple right here. They have found the base foundations of this one and through here. They're actually uncovering most of this today, and you can go and see them, the ruins. So we get to who the Aztec were. Now we get to, of course, a little review with just basic high school stuff that you probably learned back in high school or even college. and that is the Spanish arrival in the New World. As we all know, it all begins in about 1492 when Christopher Columbus, who was Italian but is sailing for Spain, he comes over here, lands in the Bahamas in October of 1492, says that, oh no, I landed in India. Well, you didn't land in India, buddy, you landed in a new continent. But anyway, after, as we all know, Christopher Columbus's discovery of the New World, or quotes around the discovery thing because we can argue about that. But anyway, his rediscovery of the New World in 1492 leads to the colonization of the Americas by European powers. In particular, the first and most powerful European power at first to colonize the New World is Spain. Now, the first European to actually arrive in Aztec territory was Francisco Hernandez de Cordoba, who was sent from Cuba to explore the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. Now, Cordoba landed in the Yucatan Peninsula with about 100 men, and he landed there in the year 1517. Now, Cordoba learned from the natives. He did not actually meet Aztec people there, but he was officially in one of their tribute states. He did not meet the Aztec. He did not see their sophisticated peoples yet. So he's seeing a basic society, but from the natives that he met in the Yucatan Peninsula on the coast, he learned of the stories that there was a much larger and more powerful state further inland from the Yucatan Peninsula, and that this people was ruling over them. It was a massive and powerful state, and he brought this news back to the Spanish authorities in Cuba, saying that we gotta go inland because they're telling me that there's something bigger here, and they're rich in gold. Which, of course, we all know, the Spanish, their main priority for ruling the New World at first was nothing but gold. They wanted precious metal, and they would do anything to get it. They were gold hungry. So if you're saying that the Aztec got gold, well, we better bet you the Spanish are coming, because they want it. They're greedy. Now, Spanish governor of Cuba, Diego Velazquez, decided to send an expedition to Mexico under the command of Hernán Cortes. And he sent this, and Cortes and his men landed at Tabasco on the Yucatan Peninsula in March of 1519. Now, Cortes had been ordered to simply set up a base on the Yucatan Peninsula's coast. He had not been ordered to go inland yet until that base was established, and then the governor would send another force to actually head inland. He had not intended Cortes to go inland and find the Aztec people. Instead, Cortes does not just found a base, he founds a town. He founds the town of Veracruz, which of course is still there today in Mexico, on the Mexican coast, and he then uses native guides to help him march inland to find the Aztec capital. He's defying the governor's orders at this point. And many native peoples actually end up allying with Cortes and his Spanish conquistadors as he heads inland because of the resentment they feel toward Aztec rule and the ongoing war that they were already having with them. And by this time, many of the allied states with the Aztec were growing tired of the alliance. They would increasingly see how the Aztec were kind of dominating it. And of course, the tributary states were getting fed up because they were tired of passing along their wealth, passing along their people and their resources to the Aztec. They were sick of it. And by the time the Spanish arrived, some of these states are already trying to go to war with the Aztec. There's a civil war basically going on within the empire. So the Spanish really come at a good time because these rebelling peoples see the Spanish as allies to use to throw off Aztec rule. So they more than willingly ally with Cortes, knowing that the Spanish will probably kill the Aztec because they know the gold's there. Now, Cortes and his men eventually did reach the capital of Tenochtitlan in November of 1519. And when he was there, he met with the Aztec Emperor Moctezuma II. However, the Aztecs did nothing to oppose the Spanish at first. Instead, the Aztecs in general greeted the Spaniards as honored guests when they arrived in the capital of Tenochtitlan. Because the emperor in particular, and many of the Aztecs, because of Cortes's pale, light skin, believed that he was a living god. They believed that he was the reincarnated form of the god Quetzalcoatl, who was one of the most important Aztec gods, because he was light-skinned, as they depicted him in their drawings. And the Aztec, like, oh my goodness, the god has come back! We must bow! They thought that Cortes was a divine being, And they thought the Spaniards were divine because they also came in on horses and all these other things with dogs and horses and stuff that the Aztec had never seen before. Guns, they'd never seen any of this before. So they thought this must be divine. Now, the Aztec army was thousands strong compared to the few hundred Spanish, about 100 men that Cortes brought with him to Tenochtitlan. So thus, Moctezuma didn't really have any fear that something was going to happen because he figured Cortes ain't going to try nothing. I'm sitting here in my center of power. My army is thousands strong just outside, and this guy's got a mere 100 men. He's not going to try nothing. So he felt very self-assured that he was safe within his walls of his city. However, as we mentioned, the Spanish have several advantages over the Aztec in terms of technology. They've brought guns. The Aztec don't have guns, they have clubs. I'm pretty sure a club's not going to stop a bullet. They have war dogs. Now, the Aztec had dogs, but not war dogs. Not dogs that are trained to literally attack people. The Spanish had metal armor, which the Aztec had no idea how they were going to dent that if they went to war because they had never seen anybody wear metal armor. They knew what metal was, but they'd not really seen anyone wear it. And then, of course, the Spanish have a very big advantage when they have horses. The Aztec have never seen a horse. Now, Cortes took advantage of this. He knew that he had these technological advantages. And by knowing this, he took advantage of this once he was inside the main palace with Moctezuma, him and his men took the Aztec emperor hostage, and they gained control of the city through that hostage crisis. Now, the Aztec people grew very angry, and when Moctezuma failed to bring peace, he was killed by under unknown conditions. The legend is that he was actually stoned by his own people because he was sitting there doing nothing while the Spanish were making demands on the Aztecs saying, give us all your gold, give us all your metal, give us all whatever it was that was of value to the Spanish, and they were demanding it of the Aztec while holding their emperor hostage, and the Aztec just got fed up with it. And the legend is that Cortes tried to use Moctezuma to try to appease the Aztec, to try to get them to calm down and cooperate, and instead they stoned him to death, supposedly. Now, after Moctezuma's death, his nephew, Temoc, or however you say his name, I'm not going to exactly try to because it's an odd Nahuatl name, he becomes emperor after Moctezuma's death, and he and the Aztecs drive out Cortes from the Aztec Empire. They drive him out from Tenochtitlan, they drive him out from the empire as a whole. Now, since the Aztecs had no immunity to diseases that the Spanish brought, this becomes their downfall. The Spanish might have left Tenochtitlan, the Aztec Empire, but they brought over diseases with them from Europe, like smallpox, and most notably, they also brought the flu, influenza, as we would call it, the common cold, measles, chickenpox. But smallpox by far becomes the most endemic among the Aztec population. And the Aztec Indians, Native Americans, have no immunity to these diseases because they have never been exposed to them before. They have never encountered these diseases. Their body has no immunity. And thus, thousands of Aztec within the year after Cortes leaves in early 1520, thousands of them end up dying from smallpox epidemic within the empire itself, and especially in Tenochtitlan. In fact, in Tenochtitlan alone, by 1520, 40% of the entire city's population was dead from smallpox because of this disease that the Spanish had brought unknowingly. Now, Cortes eventually did return to Tenochtitlan on August 13th of 1521, 500 years ago this August, and he lay siege to the city with an army of a ever larger army of Spanish and native tribes. Eventually, it didn't take very long for the technologically superior Spanish to crush the Aztec. The Aztec lost thousands of people in the battle to try to save their city, and the Spanish only lost a couple hundred. That was how technologically superior the Spanish were. And plus, it goes with their warfare style. As we mentioned, the Aztec were trained in warfare. They weren't trained to kill the enemy. They were trained to capture. The Spanish are very much trained to kill. They don't aim to capture. They aim to kill. So that's putting them at odds with the Aztec, who not only have a less superior warfare technology. They were armed with clubs, while the Spanish got muskets and bullets and war dogs and horses and metal armor. But you also got the factor here that the Spanish are basically, they're fighting to kill, the Aztec are fighting to capture. Think who's going to put more carefulness in his attacks because he's aiming not to hurt the person he's supposed to kill. Eventually, the Spanish win, and the capital eventually fell with over 240,000 Aztec killed in the course of the siege. The Spanish, as we mentioned, lost very few. Not only a couple hundred, not even 1,000 men. The fall of Tenochtitlan ends up being what ends the Aztec Empire and the Aztec civilization as a whole. Now, there are pockets of resistance that kind of hold out for a couple more decades, but effectively it breaks the back of the Aztecs. Their empire is done, and by the end of the century, their civilization is pretty much died out. It's extinct today. There are related tribes and people that are still around in Mexico today that still speak the Nahuatl language, but the Aztec people themselves are actually gone. Now, after Tenochtitlan was taken, Cortes and the Spanish raised Tenochtitlan. They burned it to the ground, destroyed the temple, destroyed the buildings, because they saw the Aztecs as heathens. They were not... Spain was extremely Catholic at this time, and it still is to some extent. And they viewed that these Native Americans did not know God. They were heretics. They were blasphemers. They weren't human because they worshipped other polytheistic gods, which the Bible states that you are only to have one God, and that is He who is in heaven. To the Spanish, who are extremely and ardent Catholics, these are animals. They're not human to them. Now, of course, they were, and that was a very wrong thing of the Spanish to assume. But because the Spanish assumed this, they gave them no respect, and thus they raised Tenochtitlan. This glorious marvel of engineering and human construction was razed to the ground, burnt, and demolished. And on top of the ruins, Spain built Mexico City under Cortes's guidance. Mexico City is now the capital of Mexico. During the time of the Spanish colonial empire in the Americas, Mexico City was actually the capital of the Spanish colony of New Spain. It was the center of Spanish dominance in the New World until the independence of Mexico in the 1820s, which was the 19th century. So for about 3 centuries, it was the center of Spanish power in the New World. But they razed this beautiful city and just built another city right on top of the ruins, which is why if you go to Mexico City today, you can still see some of the ruins that they're starting to excavate from underneath the city. But it also meant that Lake Texcoco was going to end because in the years since, Mexico City kind of, as its population grew, needed more and more water, and Mexico is very arid in most areas, and the Valley of Mexico was sitting in the middle of a lake, so they kept drawing from the lake. Well, eventually, the city kept growing, and the population kept growing, and they've used up almost every bit of the water out of Lake Texcoco that now, today, most of the lake is now dried up. It's not there anymore. Hardly any of it is, and Mexico City is actually commonly experiencing drought problems. It's actually sunk about 14 feet because into the ground from its original level, above sea level position and elevation because of the draining of the water. But this massive lake is not there really anymore. There's a few remnants of it. I think there's a few ponds around Mexico City. What's the one? Oh, what is the one? There is a couple of the original Aztec Canalways. Xochimilco, I think is what it's called, something like that, that you can go down there and they actually have some of the original canalways still intact, the Aztec themselves used. But as a whole, the lake is gone, and Mexico City is built right on top of the old Aztec ruins. But this is what brought an end to the Aztec Empire. So before we kind of conclude here, of course, more. Right here we have an image of portrait, I guess, of Hernandez Cortes, the Spanish conquistador who led the destruction of Tenochtitlan. He eventually, I think, became the governor of New Spain for a time. He was the one responsible who led most of this for the Spanish side. And then right here is just a painting of the taking in 1521 of the siege of Tenochtitlan by the Spanish. And it just kind of contrasts, how bad it was in terms of technological difference, because you have Over here on the main causeway going into the city, you have the Spanish on their horses. They got armor, they got guns. And then over here, the Aztec only got like little wooden boats. They got very little armor on them. They're armed with clubs. They were not going to win against this. It was very much a one-sided fight. So that concludes our little video for today. Might be a little shorter than most, but I thought it was a topic that we should at least discuss, since this year is 500 years since that happened, and it is a major turning point in the history of the Americas, as it marked the deaths of one of the major Native American empires at that time. So we wanted to cover that topic. I don't know exactly what our next topic is going to be here yet. I'm still pondering. Hopefully we're going to be able to get back to normal, at least one video a week here very soon. I would think it's going to be very soon, within the next week or two. We're going to get back on the schedule. I do apologize for the continued delays and everything else. Stuff just keeps popping up, but I know for certain that we are going to be able to get back on track here within the next 2 weeks. So that's a good thing. So that kind of concludes our video today. So as always, like, subscribe, thumbs up, thumbs down, comments if you got any, or questions. I'll feel free to answer them if I can get to them. Basically just the usual stuff. If you got any suggestions for any videos that you on any topics that you would like to hear about, be sure to suggest them in the comment section below. So as always, have a good rest of your week, and may God bless you all.